When historians talk about San Francisco in 1906, they usually focus on the destruction above ground. The violent earthquake at 5:12 a.m., the fires that burned for 3 days, the ruins stretching over 400 blocks. But the real story, the one missing from reconstruction reports and still buried in municipal footnotes today, began beneath the surface. It all started with a massive cleanup. Engineers were told to clear debris across the shattered city, remove rubble from collapsed buildings, and get the ground ready for San Francisco's ambitious rebuilding. As the nation watched the city rise from the ashes, the goals were practical. Stabilize the terrain, assess the damage, and figure out if the land could support a rebuilt metropolis. But once workers started digging through the destruction, something unexpected occurred. They broke through layers not exposed in decades. Underneath the 1906 rubble, deeper than anyone thought possible, crews found tunnels and chambers that didn't match any known infrastructure. Their scale was enormous, their construction unusual, and the stonework didn't look like anything in San Francisco's recorded history. It didn't even resemble the Victorian-era construction that supposedly defined the city. Public reconstruction reports never mentioned it, and newspapers covering the rebuilding effort didn't print it. But in that year's internal notes, a quiet phrase appears again and again. Pre-existing tunnels, unexpected depth, origin unknown. Later, the official story would simplify everything. Old sewers, forgotten mining tunnels, or just misidentified earthquake damage. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussing. Yet the survey photographs from the time, developed in dim municipal offices while San Francisco rebuilt, show something else. They show workers standing beside brick-lined passages built with precision far beyond anything in the city's official construction records. Tunnels wide enough for carriages, yet missing from every map. Arched corridors fitted so expertly that even in grainy early 1900s photos, the craftsmanship is unmistakable. Drainage systems carved into bedrock that appear in no city planning document. And the deeper they dug, the less the layers looked like Victorian infrastructure, and more like something built over, buried, and deliberately forgotten. At first, cleanup teams tried to categorize everything as simply as possible: old utility tunnels, abandoned mines, natural cracks opened by the earthquake. But as notes piled up and more passages were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some tunnels built on a scale far larger than anything San Francisco needed in the 1800s? Why were certain sections lined with bricks, laid so precisely that modern engineers still can't explain the method? Why did some corridors extend beneath areas that were supposedly untouched hillside before American settlement? And the question that troubled even the most traditional planners: why were these deeper tunnels so elaborate? Reconstruction required precise surveys of ground stability. Yet the subterranean infrastructure under parts of downtown, North Beach, and the financial district seemed built for a city far larger and far older than the San Francisco of public record. Cleanup teams quietly admitted among themselves that the depth and scale didn't match any construction timeline they knew. And although none of them used terms like hidden history, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built beneath this land before. Not simple tunnels or primitive mine shafts, a network. As documentation grew, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions vaguer, photographs stopped showing the full extent of the passages. Then, in late 1906 and early 1907, excavation zones were hastily sealed again, filled with earthquake rubble, covered with new construction, and much of what was exposed returned to darkness. Only fragments remained: notes, a handful of photos, and quiet testimonies from city workers who saw the tunnels before some sections were permanently closed. But even from what survives, a pattern emerges. Passages too elaborate for San Francisco's known history. Brickwork too advanced for the accepted timeline. Construction methods that look inherited. Infrastructure that seems to belong to a completely different era of building. When reconstruction teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the ruined city, their expectations were simple. They thought they'd find earthquake damage, maybe some old basement foundations, and scattered remnants from early gold rush construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. Within weeks, that assumption collapsed. Instead of a neat sequence of collapsed buildings and natural bedrock, the teams uncovered a stack of infrastructure layers that didn't behave the way layers of a normal city should. The first anomaly was alignment. Each layer, post-earthquake, pre-earthquake Victorian, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same grid, the same orientation, the same geometric pattern. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different city planners, different construction companies, different decades. They don't build in perfect alignment with infrastructure buried meters below them. Yet beneath San Francisco, they did. Tunnels from one era ran directly above tunnels from another. Passages lined up with passages buried far below. Drainage systems shared the same trajectory, even when separated by unknown decades or centuries. It was as if every group that ever built on this soil was following an original city plan, one that no longer existed in any archive. As workers dug deeper, the layers grew stranger. Below the expected Victorian brick and timber, they started finding stonework that looked nothing like 19th century construction. Much larger passages, much tighter brickwork. Systems that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in San Francisco's documented timeline. Some tunnels appeared almost overbuilt. Perfectly arched chambers with flawless curvature. Crafted with a precision that didn't match gold rush-era California's construction methods. Then came the discovery that puzzled even the most experienced engineers. Entire sections of the deepest tunnels were filled with hardened mud and sediment, packed so densely it took days to excavate, layer upon layer of compressed earth, as if these passages had been deliberately buried or submerged and filled naturally over time. Yet no historical record shows San Francisco experiencing flooding severe enough to fill underground tunnels to that depth. No maps indicate ancient waterways beneath those specific points. Nothing explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure look like they were intentionally entombed beneath mud and debris. Survey photographs from 1906 and 1907 show this clearly. Workers standing beside passages so large that men look small in comparison. Brickwork laid so precisely that even today engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Arches and joints resembling infrastructure far older and more sophisticated than anything Gold Rush San Francisco is credited with. But the most unsettling detail wasn't what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. Official reconstruction reports, written after the earthquake, barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest tunnels entirely. Certain infrastructure layers are summarized with vague terms like preexisting utilities or earlier construction, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss. If these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual construction techniques documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across city archives instead of gathered into a comprehensive municipal report? Even some of the brickwork raised questions: joints too tight, surfaces too smooth, patterns too uniform, marks that look less like hand-laid brick and more like mass-produced precision construction. Construction that according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those tunnels were supposedly built. What the reconstruction teams uncovered was infrastructure that didn't match Gold Rush construction, didn't match Victorian engineering, and didn't even match itself across different depths. Instead, it formed a strange architectural language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly sophisticated. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude mining tunnels or narrow utility passages. They were perfectly vaulted spaces, rooms shaped with exact proportions, arches that held their curve flawlessly across decades, and brick vaults laid out with coherence. Almost like remnants of a master infrastructure plan that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with compressed mud so dense that workers thought they'd hit solid bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed, smooth walls, fitted brick, and construction patterns that raised more questions than answers. Then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the giant circular access shafts. Officially, they were later labeled as old wells or natural sinkholes, but nothing about them fits typical well design or geological formation. They were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly cylindrical, as if cut with tools capable of maintaining flawless roundness for dozens of meters down. Some shafts were wide enough for multiple workers to descend side by side. Others narrowed gradually, almost like ventilation systems or mechanical access points for machinery. Workers from 1906 described them in private correspondence as engineered vertical passages. Not wells, but structures with a deliberate purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the placement of certain support structures. These weren't simply holding up the streets above. Many were positioned in ways that made no engineering sense for Victorian San Francisco. Massive brick pillars supporting sections that seemed to need no reinforcement. Foundation walls extending far beyond the footprint of any documented building above them. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The city above ground may not simply rest on natural bedrock. It may sit on something much larger. An infrastructure whose extent was never recorded, never mapped, and never explained in San Francisco's official history. The deeper the workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Brick tunnels appeared with perfectly straight walls. Some surfaces were glazed, smooth, almost reflective. Others showed precision, cut passages so uniform that modern construction engineers still debate what methods could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the presence of metal rails embedded in the floors of tunnels that, supposedly, predated any rail system in San Francisco. Some rails looked corroded, rusted, or fused to the brick. Yet they were found in layers supposedly older than the city's first streetcar lines. The official explanation offered later: abandoned mining cart tracks, forgotten industrial remnants. That does not explain why the rails appear in tunnels beneath areas never documented as mining sites, nor why they run in organized patterns, not randomly placed, but aligned like the infrastructure of a transit system that was never officially built. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Tunnels were sealed again. Passages were filled. Deep sections of the sites were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as structural safety concerns necessary to prevent collapses during reconstruction. But the decisions about which tunnels to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the passages closed immediately were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly vaulted chambers, The massive circular shafts, the unexplained rail systems, the elaborate brick corridors that seemed to continue far beyond the excavation zone. These tunnels were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random passages. They were part of an organized network. A grid of infrastructure that looked less like improvised mining tunnels and more like a planned city beneath the city. Aligned, measured, systematic, as if they once connected to a much larger underground system extending beneath San Francisco, long before any city, we acknowledge, ever existed on the surface. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city maps. When you study the final months of the 1906 reconstruction excavations, something becomes impossible to ignore. The projects didn't end naturally. They were stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the cleanup teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were almost routine. But by mid-1907, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last tunnels they opened beneath San Francisco weren't ordinary. They weren't Victorian utilities, they weren't gold rush remnants, they weren't even identifiable. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described brickwork that suddenly shifted from familiar to unexplainable. Walls with joints so tight you couldn't slide paper between them. Vaulted ceilings shaped with precision that pre-modern San Francisco was never supposed to have. Foundation systems built for loads far heavier than anything documented above them. And corridors that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing beneath modern buildings into unexplored darkness. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most elaborate tunnels were the ones filled in first. Workers described sealing entire passages, blocking entrances, packing earthquake rubble into spaces just uncovered. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation: earthquake damage, safety concerns, reconstruction priorities. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally sound tunnels sealed first? And why were the most damaged sections left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense, unless those deeper layers posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco truly showed construction techniques beyond gold rush capability, and if some of those passages didn't match any known city plan at all, then the entire accepted story of San Francisco's founding begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if modern San Francisco were built on top of something far older. Something massive, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the mud-filled tunnels weren't from natural flooding, but from deliberate attempts by later peoples to hide or repurpose what came before. And maybe that is why the 1906 discoveries were quietly reburied. Not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to passages that look almost industrial, arches that resemble modern engineering, drainage systems too sophisticated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. That brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest infrastructure, the most advanced layers, sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The perfect brickwork was buried. The giant circular shafts were buried. The unexplained rail systems were buried. The elaborate vaulted chambers were buried. The organized tunnel networks were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished. almost as if the excavation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the gold rush, older than American settlement, older than the narrative we were given. For one brief moment in 1906, the earthquake opened the ground just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again. Sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if San Francisco stands on top of infrastructure, built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1906. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other tunnels, what other networks, what other layers were quietly reburied long before cameras existed? The 1906 excavation wasn't just earthquake cleanup. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.